Welcome to Sleepy Dimensions, where dreams come to life. Relax, unwind, and let go of the day's worries as you drift into a world of comfort and fantasy. The smell of wet pavement filled the air, still hinting at the rain that had come down earlier. Alex shifted uncomfortably on the cold stone steps leading down to the river, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. Beside him, Mia sat next to him, knees pulled to her chest, just a still figure against the sprawling city behind them. The Seine rippled softly below, catching the dim streetlights' reflections, and in the distance, an accordion played softly in the night. His eyes drifted to her, tracing the familiar curve of her cheek in the half-light. Her profile, outlined in the shadows, stirred something inside him, a mix of comfort and a heavy sadness. His chest tightened at the tremor in her lips, as though she was trying to hold back a flood of words. "Do you ever wonder why we met?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost to the city's night sounds. She didn't meet his gaze, just stared at the dark water, her question lingering between them. Alex swallowed, his throat dry. "All the time," he wanted to say, but the words lodged in his throat. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice betraying more than he wanted. "I do." She let out a breath that seemed to deflate her, sounding more like a sigh than relief. "It feels like we're in a bubble, like it's going to pop any second now." Her voice cracked, just barely, before she quickly laughed it off. "We can't stay here forever, can we?" He wanted to respond, to say something to ease the tension growing between them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, his eyes dropped to the slick cobblestones, and he finally admitted, "I'm going back to New York tomorrow." Each word tasted bitter, like something was tearing away inside of him. "I wanted to stay. God, I wanted to stay, but what would that even mean?" Mia's hand found its way to his knee. Her hand felt light, hesitant even, but the chill of her fingers hit him like a shock. His breath caught. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his, dark and unreadable. "I know," she whispered. "I know you can't." Her hand lingered there, the chill of her skin against his, and the silence between them felt heavy, like all the things left unspoken were pressing down. His mind raced, full of memories, how they used to stay up late talking about their futures, how she would paint in the early mornings while he made them coffee, how she'd once told him that their hearts beat in the same rhythm. Now, that rhythm was faltering. "I can't stop painting," she said softly, pulling her hand away. "It's the only thing that makes sense anymore." Could I ask him to stay? Would he give it up for me? No, that's not fair. But maybe... The thoughts flickered across her face, unspoken, as she tucked her hands back into her sleeves as if to protect herself from the night's cold, and from him. That first night back in New York, the city felt colder, more distant. Alex lay in bed after a long day, the quiet of his apartment swallowing him whole. His phone buzzed with messages from friends, colleagues, the usual distractions, but none from her. He unlocked it, scrolling absently through old photos of Paris, his finger hesitating over one of them by the river. The light had caught her smile just right, and for a moment, the rest of the world had fallen away. He typed out a message. "I miss you." His thumb hovered over the send button, but his heart clenched in hesitation. What good would it do? What could he possibly say to bridge the space between them now? He deleted the words, closed his eyes, and felt the weight of her absence sink deeper into his bones. Back in her studio, Mia stood motionless before a blank canvas. The smell of paint filled the room, but for once, it brought no comfort. She hadn't painted in days. She picked up her phone, scrolling through photos she had promised herself she wouldn't look at. There it was, the one from that night by the Seine, where Alex's eyes had sparkled with something unsaid, something they never had the courage to say. Her fingers hovered over the screen, aching to type something, anything. "I miss you." But the words felt impossible, a cruel reminder of what was lost. She locked the phone and threw it down on her cluttered desk. The canvas before her remained as empty as she felt. Alex often found himself dreaming of her, of wandering through Paris, chasing after her silhouette in the mist. No matter how fast he ran, she always slipped just out of reach, dissolving into the distance before he could touch her. He'd wake in the middle of the night, the ache of her absence tangible, the city around him still pulsing, but somehow empty. Mia's dreams came too, but softer. Hazy memories of wandering through art galleries, laughing and leaning into each other like old lovers. But there was always a moment, always a turn where Alex would vanish into the crowd, and she would wake up with tears in her eyes, unable to shake the feeling of him slipping away. In the weeks after his return, Alex carried around a small sketchbook. He hadn't picked up a pencil in years, but now it felt like a lifeline. The pages were filled with half-formed memories, sketches of the Seine, the curve of Mia's cheek, the way her hair caught the light in those fleeting moments. Sometimes, as he flipped through the pages, he could swear he still smelled her perfume, a faint trace of her lingering on the paper. Mia kept a small photo of them tucked into a corner of her studio. It was from their last week together in Paris, their faces close, the light of the city casting them in a soft glow. Every time she looked at it, her chest ached. She wondered if she'd ever paint something that captured what she felt for him. But every time she tried, the canvas remained stubbornly blank, the memories too heavy to put into color. The gallery felt bare, with stark white walls that echoed the emptiness around him. Voices echoed, bouncing off the polished concrete floor as Alex wandered through the room, his mind still half immersed in the business meeting he had just left. He wasn't here for the art, not really. He was killing time before his flight back to New York, but the riot of colors on the canvas before him had stopped him in his tracks. There was a rawness to it, a chaos that felt unsettlingly familiar. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing on the signature in the corner. His heart skipped a beat. Mia. Suddenly, the room felt too small, too loud. He straightened, trying to breathe, scanning the gallery almost instinctively. And there she was, Mia. She stood at the far end of the room, her back to him, gazing at one of her paintings. She looked older, more composed, but still undeniably her. For a moment, the memory of her cold hand on his knee by the Seine flooded back, sharp and vivid. His feet felt rooted to the floor, frozen by a mix of longing and uncertainty. We were never supposed to fit together, he thought. But God, did I want to try. Then she turned, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on him. Her expression shifted, surprise, followed by something more guarded. She blinked, as if not entirely sure it was him, but then a soft, tentative smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Alex," she breathed, taking slow steps toward him. Her voice was the same, low, intimate, as though they were still sitting by the river all those years ago. He smiled, though his throat felt tight. Mia. Her name tasted like all the years that had passed between them, too quick, too painful. They stood there, the tension between them palpable. His chest tightened as he thought of all the unsaid things, all the moments they could have had but missed. He wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but his hands stayed at his sides. The gallery noise faded, leaving only the space between them. "I didn't expect to see you here," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd meant. Mia let out a soft laugh, brushing her sleeve with nervous fingers. "Neither did I." His eyes flicked toward the paintings on the walls. "You've done well," he said, a note of pride threading through his words. She glanced at her work before looking back at him. "Yeah, it's been a long time." "Too long," he echoed, the words heavy with everything unsaid. She reached out then, just briefly, her hand brushing his arm. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a ripple through him, like the cold bite of her hand on his knee so many years ago. When she pulled away, her fingers lingered in the air for just a second longer, as if she hadn't wanted to let go. "Are you still in New York?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his face for something, an answer maybe, or an unspoken truth. "Yeah, still working, still living," he said, but the words felt hollow. He wanted to tell her how often he'd thought about her, how many times he'd looked for her face in crowds, how every part of his life since Paris had felt incomplete without her. "And you're still painting," he added, gesturing to the walls. "Yeah, it's what I do," she replied, but her smile was faint, fading with the years between them. Could I have given it up for him? Would I have been enough? The question echoed in her mind, unspoken, but there. They stood there, surrounded by people and art, yet somehow entirely alone. "Timing, huh?" she said, her voice wavering. "It was never right for us." Alex clenched his fists. "No," he admitted. "It wasn't." The weight of her words hit him hard, sinking in deep. Mia looked at him, her eyes full of something between longing and resignation. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said quietly. "Going back to Paris." He nodded, the words catching in his throat. "Of course." Her smile was sad, but there was no bitterness in it. "I guess we'll just keep running into each other, won't we?" "Maybe," he said softly. "Or maybe we were never supposed to get it right." That night, back in his hotel room, Alex lay in the dim light, Berlin's glow washing over him through the window. He closed his eyes, replaying every moment from the gallery. Her touch, the sound of her voice, the way her eyes had flickered with something unspoken. What if... The thought clawed at him, relentless. What if he'd stayed in Paris? What if he'd asked her to come with him? What if they hadn't let life pull them apart? The sadness lingered, wrapping itself around him like the chill of the night air by the Seine. Maybe they were never meant to fit neatly into each other's lives, but their story, with all its messy edges and missed chances, was still theirs. Even now, in the quiet of his hotel room, she lingered. And that, he realized, was love.